I think I wrote this mostly Monday morning. And I think I wrote it as an essay. And if I were reading it as an essay, it kind of makes sense. There are lines in between sections that let you know, oh, now we're transitioning to something that may not quite fit with what's next. So, hang with it. That's all I'm saying. Till Armageddon, no shalom, no shalom. Then the father hen will call his chickens home. The wise man will bow down before the throne, and at his feet they'll cast their golden crowns when the man comes around. Who's that? Johnny Cash. One of the last songs he wrote. And sang in that sort of old man, gravelly sort of voice. It's a little gendered, but very useful. So as we start, let me just give you the usual reminder from the text that we just read. It is important not to read the Gospels through an anti-Semitic hermeneutic. Hermeneutic is, like a framework through which you read something. Anti-Semitic, you know what that means, right? It's important not to read the Gospels through an anti-Semitic hermeneutic. Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the city that kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to it, right? And who lives in Jerusalem? Jews. So you can use this as a tool, if you want to be anti-Semitic. But you probably shouldn't, because here Jerusalem is the center of religious life. It is the center of this place of collusion with empire, with oppression, with religion, with tradition, all of these pieces that come together in order to keep everyone under control and in their proper place. This is Jesus' lament. The place where the prophets are killed is not just Jerusalem, is it? It happens all over the place. Jesus says later, or before that, he says it's impossible for a prophet to be killed outside of Jerusalem. That's not really even historically accurate. And I would imagine Jesus knows that not all the prophets were killed in Jerusalem. But this is this center, this weight where all of the collusion happens. He's talking about these prophets, mostly like 8th century BCE prophets, Amos and Isaiah and Jeremiah, Micah, who would say things like, real spirituality is loosing the bonds of injustice, untying yokes, liberating the oppressed, sharing bread, housing the unhoused, and clothing the naked, the very things we read this morning in our call to worship. That's what it all looks like. Or as the book of James later on says, pure religion is taking care of orphans and widows and not allowing yourself to be corrupted by power. That's not really a new thought. The prophets were saying that. Jews in the day of Jesus were saying that. Everyone was saying that. The Pharisees were saying that. That's what they were aiming for, is how to live righteously in the world, to create a more just and generous and generative society. And if some of them got off track and were corrected by Jesus, that doesn't mean all of them got off track and needed to be corrected. Till Armageddon, no shalom, no shalom. Till the father hen calls his chickens home. I don't know why he did that. I don't know why he chose to do this little bit of gender-bending poetry. I do know that he was sitting down to write this song, and he called his son and said, hey, what's peace in Arabic? And his son said, shalom. And he said, oh, it's kind of like shalom. Yeah, because they're related languages. But what an important thing, right? To try to draw these two traditions that at this point in history are so antithetical to one another, and to take this image of a hen and to make it masculine. What an interesting move. And I don't know why, and I wish I could ask. Why did you do that? Why did you choose that? And you couple that with this kind of solidarity with the marginalized that Johnny Cash always represented. The poor, the beaten down, those who are living in the hopeless, hungry side of town, prisoner who is paid for their crime, the sick, the lonely old, the reckless ones, the lives that could have been. Each week we lose 100 fine young men, believing the Lord was on their side. Another 100,000 who have died, believing we were all on their side. Drawing all of these pieces together in this sort of apocalyptic vision. This apocalyptic vision that informs so much art, so much literature, so much music, that makes a critique of the ways of empire, the rock that sits at the center of how we organize ourselves, no matter how well-meaning we are. It seems to start to drift and fall apart. And apocalypse comes along and pulls away the cover and says, look at that. That's where the pain is. But apocalypse doesn't just leave you there, critiquing the center of empire, saying, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you who kill the prophets, right? Apocalypse also paints this picture of what might possibly be, this vision of a world that is renewed, what Jesus calls the kingdom of God, this realm reign, this web of divine connection that draws us towards something else and something new. So here's where there's a line in my essay, because then we move on. Guernica is a little town in Basque country in northern Spain. 1937, the fascist Francisco Franco was having trouble with Antifa, which was a real thing then. Like they were stirring up trouble, fighting the fascists. They were anti-fascist. So he called, I don't know if he called, he might have sent a letter, called a couple of fascist bros, Italy and Germany, and said, hey, can you all help me out? So they bombed this little town, 5,000 people. And about a third of the population was killed. The town was obliterated, destroyed. That kind of all-out total war that was not just the domain of fascist regimes in World War II. Ask people in Dresden, ask people in Hiroshima. That was the way people did things then. That was the way empires clashed with one another, and the people at the bottom were crushed by that. Thank God that doesn't happen anymore. Right? We finally figured that out. I'm being sarcastic. Because we haven't learned that. So a woman named Dora Maar was one of Pablo Picasso's muses, lovers, much beset person. He was not a great guy. I don't know if you know much about Pablo Picasso. Great artist, horrible human being. She was a surrealist photographer. And it looks as though some of her techniques, some of the ways that she saw the world or recreated the world, kind of drifted into the way he also did art. So he painted a very famous, gigantic black and white and gray painting called Guernica. Right. And even though it's kind of cubist, kind of surrealist, it is horrifying, isn't it, to look at? It's devastating. I think it's the unreal nature of the images that draw you into the reality of the images that he's trying to represent. This surrealist painting. There's a story that I think might be apocryphal, that when the Gestapo came into Paris, a Gestapo officer went to Picasso's apartment, and there on the wall was a big photograph of this painting. And the officer said, did you do that? And Picasso said, no, you did. Now, I don't want to give him too much credit for being prophetic, but that's possible, and it's likely, and it's true. So in 1985, the Rockefeller family gave a tapestry to the UN that was a replica of that painting, 10 by 22 feet. It's this massive tapestry. And they hang it up in the Security Council chamber. And there it hangs as a reminder. This is sort of what we are organizing ourselves against, right? This is the place where we want to try to diffuse the imperial impulses of humanity. And let's just be honest, not done the best job in the world. Maybe things would have been worse without that organization, without the United Nations. Probably. But still, a lot of things trickle through. I think it was 18 years later, Colin Powell, who is a hero to both conservatives and liberals for reasons I don't quite understand, stood in front of that painting, in front of that tapestry. But before his speech began to justify invading Iraq on trumped-up charges, a blue curtain was drawn in front of the tapestry. So we don't have to look at that. Now, maybe someone thought, well, it's just too busy. It's like a quilt behind a phenomenal preacher. We don't want to see that. We need a blank. We need something that's solid so you don't get distracted. You know how that is, right? Every Sunday, you're probably like, oh, look at that. I can't remember what Ian said. Maybe that's why. Maybe it was all about the visuals, but maybe it was more about the optics. And we were worried about that. And today, I think, still, some of the same people who were cheerleaders for the United States invading another country are also clutching their pearls over Russia invading another country in this imperial move. It is exactly the same move. The same thing is happening. And some of those same folks who are just devastated by Russia's invasion of Ukraine are also okay with Israel's policies against Palestine. So last week, as you all know, I wasn't sure on Monday how much this was going to be in the news cycle, because you know how fast things go? You hadn't noticed? Well, it's pretty fast. It is one outrage session after another, right? And maybe that's part of it. Maybe that's part of the program. Last week, Mahmoud Khalil was arrested. Grad student from Columbia University, not really involved in the protests that were taking place, but more involved in trying to figure out how to help these groups of students negotiate with the university, kind of this go-between, because at the ripe old age of, I think last year, the ripe old age of 29, he was the person who could do that. And also, based on his studies and his personality, I think that would work. He's been accused of all sorts of things. This is something he said, I believe that the liberation of the Palestinian people and the Jewish people are intertwined and go hand in hand, and you cannot achieve one without the other. So this leaves me a little bit, I don't know, confused, and maybe a little bit hopeful, because a year ago, I had conversations with people I think of as liberal butts. The people who say, I'm liberal, but. And whenever they say that, they don't say, but I'm also a communist. They don't say I'm also further left. They say, I'm liberal, but I also want to be able to oppress this particular group of people. And you've encountered folks like this. I'm super liberal, but I don't think trans people should have the rights that they're asking for. Right? Have you met, maybe you've had these conversations. I've had the pleasure of having these conversations. I'm liberal, but I think that Palestinians are all terrorists. They would say the very same thing that now we're really offended by when, this is such a dumb thing, when the president decided to call Chuck Schumer a Palestinian, as though Palestinian is an insult. It's just, yeah, I know. Again, at those conversations with people on the other side last year, the same kinds of conversations. Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the city that kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to it. This seems in some ways to be a time of apocalypse, but the apocalypse has been happening. This isn't something that's brand new to us. In the book, The Shock Doctrine, Naomi Klein talks about disaster capitalism. This is what happens when there is either a human-caused disaster like war or a natural disaster, hurricanes, floods, fires, all manner of things. And groups of people sweep in and buy everything up and privatize everything. This is kind of a plan. It's a way of doing capitalism. You can do it. It happened in Russia after the fall of the Soviet Union. A bunch of very wealthy people started buying everything up, and now we call them the Russian oligarchs. They had all the power. It happened in New Orleans. It happens over and over again, and I wonder why there can't be something like disaster mutual aid, where people who mean well, mean better, and don't mean just for themselves can come in and create new possibilities, new impossibilities where there was nothing before. Why resurrection can't just be more than an old story, but this vision of how we renew the world. And this is true. Joe mentioned this to me again last week, one of my favorite little quips from the anarchist Antonio Gramsci: the old world is dying. Bam. That's it. The old world is dying. We've been watching it die, and we're watching the increased speed with which it dies. But then Gramsci goes on that a new world struggles to be born. And there's no guarantee that the new world will be born. There is no possibility. There's only possibility that it will be born. Nothing written in stone. But what if that were the new world that we were creating? Public good instead of private profit. What a strange world that would be. And then he says, now is the time of monsters. That was true 100 years ago, and it's true now. What he actually said in Italian was, I'm not going to say it in Italian, but what he actually said in Italian was, in this interregnum, a great variety of morbid symptoms appear, which to me sounds even worse than the time of monsters. It's so much more vague, isn't it? A great variety of morbid symptoms. But this is not the time that we should be shrinking back. We should be moving forward instead. I've never been really interested in virtues per se, but recently I keep hearing people talking about virtues, about Aristotle and the old virtues, all of those things. Do you remember when William Bennett wrote a book called The Book of Virtues? He was he's kind of a racist, classist, warmonger. He was also the Secretary of Education under Ronald Reagan. Tried to shut down the Department of Education. He's the kind of guy lots of liberals pine for these days. But anyway, he wrote this book about virtues. And I never read it because he didn't seem like a very virtuous person, but I can't help thinking about this one, these virtues like wisdom, justice, courage, moderation. And it seems like this is a time for virtues, a time for things like courage. Courage, when Jesus laughs at the Herods of the world, they come to Jesus and they say, Herod is going to kill you. And Jesus says, get in line. I've got bigger fish trying to murder me. I'm going to Jerusalem. Herod is a petty king. I'm going to go get killed by the empire. If you want to kill me, you're going to have to fight with them. That's the way it works. This is the threat that I'm heading toward. That's what courage looks like. And Jesus isn't, in this text, is not talking about triumph. He's talking about defeat. I am going to be defeated by someone much greater than you are. And off he goes, not happily, but off he goes anyway. He moves forward. And what precipitated this warning from the Pharisees that Jesus was going to be killed? What happens right before this little snippet of text that we read? Jesus says this, people will come from the east and the west, the north and the south, and take their place at the banquet in the kingdom of God. Jesus is hoping and promising this mass and inclusive and generous and generative new world that doesn't put people in different categories, in different compartments, but draws together as many people as possible. That's what Jesus is inviting us toward. Now is the time of monsters, but it's not a time to shrink away, to fall back, to fade back. Jesus says, look, your house is left to you, which I think is a great enigmatic little phrase, isn't it? Your house is left to you. And maybe that's something we can say to all of the empire building, all of the oppressive and difficult and painful ways of being in the world. We'll leave that house to you. We have other things to do. And it doesn't mean that they're going to be easy. Today, tomorrow, and the next day, I must be on my way, because it is impossible for a prophet to be killed outside of Jerusalem. It's not only for Jesus, it's an invitation, I'm sorry to say, for all of us. And I don't want to be this person that always quotes Tolkien, but I'm going to today. Frodo says, I wish the ring had never come to me. I wish none of this had happened. And Gandalf says, so do all who live in such times. But that is not for them to decide. All we have to decide is what to do with the time that is given to us. Amen?